Hey, Inspire Tribe, my fellow freedom lovers. It's John Nolan here. Thank you so much for tuning in to another Inspired live stream. It is Friday, April 26, 2024. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're whole, we're free. We're winning as long as we keep seeking the truth. Welcome in the live chat. Welcome on YouTube, Rumble, and X. This is part 3 of the end of religion as we know it. We're discussing based on the findings of this man here, Mauro Bilinio. We're discussing uh, findings from the Bible that probably they aren't exclusive to Mauro. Some things I think only he found, or at least in that context, others have confirmed this, and it has sparked definitely a very interesting discussion. Now, I want to quickly say something about various comments that we received before we go into this third part today. We'll talk about Adam and Eve. We'll talk about the original sin. We'll talk about the apple. And I'm telling you, this will blow your mind. I mean, it is mind blowing. Of course, he's not the first person to suggest this might mean something different, especially if we look at the literal translation. But what I wanted to share is that I've heard two things. One thing with regards to this series, people have been saying, don't you know that the New World Order, these cabal forces, they want to tear down all religions and replace them with one Luciferian religion? Of course. Of course, I know that. But as I've said so many times, currently, these wannabe elites, these dark forces, are tearing down the system, and they're tearing or they are tearing down even religions. And I've said many times in that regard, we are quite aligned. We don't want this system that we've been having for so long that enslaved humanity. It doesn't mean we're aligned with them on anything that they suggest. It just means that currently we're all basically doing the same thing, but we're competing for a different outcome, right? So that's the whole key point here. They want to lead the human family even further away from anything that resembles truth, facts, about everything, and put them into this game over control system. And we're saying we don't want that, but the only way we can explore what we really want is truth. So that's to preface that. Yes, we're we're doing the same thing. The way they built this, and I've explained this many times, this is a system. In this system, they build something up which is false. It's always a false prophet, a false system, a false narrative. They build it up and they lead people to believe in that, believe in the justice system, believe in the religious, the scientific model, doesn't matter, until people believe in it. And then, and this is what people can't understand, then they themselves tear it down. Why? It is a form of demoralization and psychological abuse. If all of our energy, all of our attention, all of our beliefs are invested in one thing because we think it's true, because we build our lives on that, and then that is shown to be false, we are disillusioned, we're demoralized. And so that's what they're doing. They build the false prophet, they're tearing the false prophet down. And then they'll say, here's the real thing. It's all a deception. Okay. So this is kind of and by the way, I'm absolutely blown away by how many others are currently speaking about this subject of religious programming and how it's going to um you know basically drive people insane once they see it. I just heard somebody told us that Cliff High keeps saying that in June, as a matter of weeks, the masses will start awakening to this and go insane. And of course, this is something we've all been feeling, that at some point we reach the tipping point. And I've always assumed that religion was going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak. And I think that just might be it. It just might be it. It's the deepest programming. It goes the furthest back, and it keeps people the most enslaved in a certain way of thinking and feeling and believing. Now, with that said, this is not to discredit the creator, whom we absolutely have a relationship with, the true prime creator, and the divinity of our spirit. So I want to preface every single live stream of this series by saying that we're not atheists, we are not Darwinists, none of that. But I will say that even before going on this journey, I never thought that the God of the Bible, the entity that is interpreted to be God, is the creator, the true creator of who we are inherently. Now, let's discover this, okay? Let's look where we are. So we're discussing this here, the Naked Bible. And of course, it is not just this book, but a lot of it comes from this book. It's very interesting. And the author, Mauro Bellino, it was after sharing some of the mistakes that he found in the Bible, in the translations, with the publisher, with the Vatican, with the Catholic publisher. After a while, and after sharing more and more mistakes, they agreed with him and they commissioned him to do official translations and corrections. And after he started writing his own books, they cut ties with him. They didn't like that. They didn't like what he was sharing. Okay, so now let's move forward here. Today we're going to talk about the story of Adam and Eve, the forbidden fruit, the apple, the snake, and the fall from paradise. We all know the story. So in fairy tales, animals can speak. From Aesop to Phaedrus to Walt Disney. The small animal that appears in Genesis is a snake. More than speak, it acts, causing the worst disaster in history, forever compromising the carefree happiness of the human race, which had until then been all but immortal. And all this because of an apple, apparently. An apple which, as a brand, incidentally, made the fortune of the well-known corporation founded by Steve Jobs. This is this is very interesting. This could go so many ways. We could interpret why they chose the apple this year as their symbol, their logo for the company. My goodness, we could go down a deep, deep rabbit hole, but that's maybe for another day. I'll just put it out there. After you watch the entire live stream today, I want you to think about why this might be the Apple logo, okay? Alrighty. So the fable is unforgettable. Idyllic conditions, perfect bliss, untouched by danger, is destroyed by a mouthful of fruit. This was the forbidden fruit, one that should not even have been touched by God's own orders. Disobedience was fatal and the punishment horrible, perpetual condemnation to a life of torment, fatigue, suffering, until the fatal outcome, death, from that moment on became an unavoidable destiny. And of course, this story is at the core of incredible programming for the human family, even far removed from religious families, even atheistic families. I can tell you this: I do not come from a family that had any sort of spiritual concept or religious concept. That just wasn't part of it. On neither sides of my parents either. Nobody was really religious or had real faith. But I can tell you that the patterns and the habits and the programs that derive from this story were just as present in our lives and in our thinking and in my upbringing as in a religious family. And that's how deep this really goes. Okay. So, not bad as a first performance by our famous God of love, who religion tells us loves his creatures unconditionally. At the first little mistake, he expelled them both from Eden, forcing them into an existence of suffering with an expiration date, concluding in death. Bellino jokes. Our scholar friend made a joke, okay? So don't take it too seriously. Of course, because the one mentioned in Genesis was certainly not God, nor were Adam and Eve our ancestors, and the aforementioned snake was certainly not a reptile. In the Talmud, it is even written that it was originally gifted with limbs. And by the way, there was never any apple mentioned in those verses. Okay, so hold on. This, I'm confused. There was no apple. The snake had limbs originally, and Adam and Eve are not our ancestors. Now, all of these stories are deeply enrooted in our culture, in our everything. Well, let's see what he says. The infamous apple eaten by Eve doesn't exist in the Hebrew Bible. The concept came in the 4th century CE when Jerome translated the Bible into Latin. Saint Jerome was a Roman biblicist, translator, theologian, and Christian monk, a church father, and a doctor of the church. He translated part of the Old Testament into Latin, but using the text that had been rewritten in Greek by the Jews of the colony of Elephantine in Egypt. Okay, so this is the series of events that led to what is now known as Apple. Writing about the tree of good and evil, Jerome used the Latin term malum, which has a double meaning. It can mean both evil and apple tree. From that moment onwards, we started talking about an apple, which became tradition. That's what Bellino says. Was paradise lost then because of an apple? No, in ancient Hebrew, taking the fruit does not mean eating the fruit. It means consuming a sexual act. Okay, so let's unpack this here just for a little bit. First off, the first time that the term apple was apparently used was 4 centuries after Jesus's life. Okay, 4 centuries after everything had unfolded. This is, again, it's not, this story is not directly connected to Jesus, but it shows us how over the centuries, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of years, things were rewritten, reinterpreted, and changed. And something that wasn't even a thing until then, it wasn't a thing until the 4th century, became the focal point of an entire tradition that has demonized women since then. And that demonization, that patriarchy that has become so strong in the Christian cultures, it's to this day that many people think subconsciously that women are responsible for our suffering. It's not a joke. As Joe, and and as Christine says, and how long did it take to establish at least a concept of equality in worthiness, not in equality as being the same. We're not saying men and women are not the same, but equally worthy. Okay, let's move forward here. But let's talk about this original sin. Sorry for the typos once again. I get so excited when I type up these things. I race through them and then I make some typos. But let's talk about this original sin for a moment. The concept of original sin, explains Bellino, is not a biblical one. It was elaborated by theology. Above all, it serves the purpose of creating a sense of guilt in the individual through which he can be conditioned and led to respect the rules, with the possibility of reconciling with the alleged Heavenly Father through intermediaries who naturally are members of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. And this, of course, whoever, I don't know about the other denominations, but if you grew up in a Catholic environment, and I certainly had my share of Catholic mass and Catholic teachings growing up in a European country, religion class was mandatory. And so I was made to feel very unworthy until I decided to get baptized, because I was made feel, I was feeling so unworthy and wanted to be part of that group that everybody was talking about. And so they told us many, many times that we are sinners. No matter what we do, we're sinners. We're born sinners. And that we might be able to do good. And of course, we have to have confession. We have to tell the Father everything. And then we have to pray certain things and rosary and whatnot. But it is that which is instilled at a very young age, this feeling of guilt and shame. guilt and shame for what we feel, guilt and shame for what we think. And there seems to be no other way, if you grow up in these religious traditions, than to confess and hopefully repent and then do it all over again, right? Which, if you only repent and if you give some money to the church, then all sins will be maybe forgiven. Okay. So the concept of original sin does not appear in Genesis. It refers to a completely different situation. Adam and Eve make a choice. As a result of that choice, they're free to reproduce independently. And here we go into a completely different story. The act performed by Eve seems, even according to Jewish tradition, to be a sexual one, through which she joins with the so-called serpent. Tradition sometimes describes this act as truly sexually violent. In other words, the snake may have raped Eve. Okay, and we're going to find out who the snake might be. It was from this sexual union of Eve with the serpent that Cain was born. It is after this act that the Elohim say, now the Adam has become like one of us. The guardians of the garden, the Gan, are actually quite afraid. They fear that the Adamites may have access to the so-called tree of life. We're really looking at a story where the creation, and I think we have to redefine these terms, the genetically engineered beings or changed beings, humans, started to make autonomous choices that led to the one choice that made them basically uncontrollable. And that seems to have been what has transpired in the quote unquote Garden of Eden, which apparently was more like a laboratory or an enclosed space for experiments. We're going to get into that. Bellini is among those who interpret the expression tree of life as something quite different, namely the technologies that guaranteed a very long life like that of the Elohim themselves. If this had happened, if the first Adamites had gained access to those genetic practices, they would have become unmanageable. So this is where this story is going, according to the findings of Bellini. This interpretation is even present in the notes of the Jerusalem Bible, where it states that in effect, the expulsion of the Adamites was not a punishment for something they had done, but rather a sort of prevention decision. So it's not Eve ate from the forbidden fruit, and that's why humanity was kicked out of paradise. Apparently, it was a safety issue. Bellini suggests that this serpent, the snake, that really apparently wasn't a snake the way that we think of it, was one of the Elohim who belonged to the faction of those who were hostile to or even an enemy of the Elohim who ruled in the Gan Eden. And this is now where we have to get a little nuanced. I think it is easy for us to understand that humans fight and humans are at war with each other, and they're constantly having troubles. But maybe if a different species, and I'm not even talking extraterrestrial cosmos, let's just leave that out, but just a different species would hear of us, perhaps they would have a hard time understanding why one species is fighting amongst each other so badly. But when people start to contemplate the concept of the Elohim, the Anunnaki, then they think of one coherent group that might not have had troubles with each other. But Bellini suggests that they did, that they were actually fighting, that they were at odds with each other, and that there were factions that were fighting with each other. And I think if we kind of keep that in mind, that might be a possibility, we have an easier time understanding what transpired in the Gan Eden. Whether you ask Hermes Sagatti, a famous theology professor, chief rabbi of Turin, or Ariel Di Porto, or Protestant biblical scholar Daniele Garone, they all don't know where the concept of original sin came from, but they agree it's not from the Bible. Okay, so this is interesting because these are not the only ones. These are just some scholars that are noteworthy, but others too say, if we don't really know where this concept comes from, the original sin. But they all say they don't really find this in the Bible. So if we remove original sin, what remains is the snake. Who was the snake? The term snake also has the meaning of possessor of knowledge. Now, this then becomes a whole different story, right? The double serpent could therefore represent profound knowledge with particular reference to the double helix of DNA. So it could have been an entity who had intimate knowledge about human genetics and engineering. So the snake could have been a rogue scientist. The snake, the serpent, could have been a rogue member of the Elohim who had profound knowledge of genetics and engineering and human engineering. Now that makes that leads this story in a completely different direction. And naturally, some of these things can only be speculated about because there's no hard evidence, right? What Bellino does is, especially for words that seem to not be translatable or hard to understand the translation in the context, he will look for those words and cross-reference. He will look for those words in different books, in different texts, and how they are used. And then when you have like 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 example of how a word is being used, you can derive its meaning, or at least attempt to. But it's definitely not a scientific definition. Okay. The Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, was an experimental laboratory. That's what Bellino thinks. The Elohim, the Bible tells us, produced every kind of tree that gave good edible fruit. In that laboratory, they experimented with food, both vegetable and animal, to be used for the workers, that is to say, humanity, which they had created through genetic engineering. In addition to the tree of life, the Gan Eden also had another tree, that of the knowledge of good and evil. And I'm going to jump on something here that he doesn't, at least not to my knowledge, write about in this book. I haven't seen it yet. But this starts to sound more and more like we're talking about a construct, a simulated construct. And to me, the more I read about this and the more I compare it to other thoughts, other findings, I think we aren't talking about prime Earth here. We're talking about a construct where the Elohim, a species, a different, and again, I'm not saying they're extraterrestrial. I don't know. For crying out loud, I've never been outside of Earth. I haven't even been on all continents yet, and certainly I can't tell you uh, for certain where we are. I don't know, but I can tell you that everything that I'm finding and experiencing tells me that this is not the playing field, if you will. This is not the Earth that was created by our prime creator, by the grand designer, the prime creator. I really come to believe that, but there's no hard evidence. How would we prove a simulation until we get out of it? But when I read this and these interpretations, it very much to me seems to allude to that. This is just my interpretation, okay? So we're talking about two trees here, the tree of life and the tree of good and evil. And now it gets very interesting. Okay, you're gonna like this. Some Hebrew interpreters, like Amos Luzzatto, say that the expression of good and evil does not refer to the ethical concept of the two terms, but rather to the physiopathology of the human body. In other words, the knowledge of good and evil indicates the experience of feeling good and ill. Now, this changes everything. And this is why Bellino states so often we're not talking about a spiritual text here. We're not talking about a spiritual thing. We're talking about historic facts, political systems, biological engineering. So what if this knowledge of good and evil doesn't mean how we act and what our morals and values are, but if it actually talks about the knowledge of what is good for us and what is bad for us, what makes us feel good or makes us feel ill. What if we're talking about bioengineering? It's it's an incredible thing to just give ourselves permission to explore that thought. This would mean that as long as they were inside the enclosed and protected place, the Garden of Eden, the Gan, the Adamites did not know physical suffering and might even have remained young in appearance until their death. The Adamites, Bellini says, are driven out because they become reproductively independent, and this should never have happened according to the Elohim's plan. So we might have at some point rebelled and decided to take a different path. Let's go forward. And above all, the breeding between the Adamites and a member of the lineage of the Elohim, which in the Bible is represented by the snake, should never have happened either. Their interbreeding was the real cause behind the expulsion of the Adamites from Gan Eden. So again, maybe a rogue Elohim possessor of knowledge, scientist, genetic engineer either had sex or even violated Eve. And the result of that was Cain, a new lineage, across a new breed, if you will. And that apparently was not in the plans of the Elohim. It is no coincidence that the commander of the garden of the Gan tells the Adamites, I will put enmity between your lineage and that of the serpent, which of course could be the beginning of all warfare that we have experienced on earth amongst each other. This could have been the beginning of all the crap that's been going on ever since. The lineage of the serpent is the one directly descended from the sexual act that the serpent, a rival Elohim, had performed with Eve, which resulted in the birth of Cain. Later on, Adam and Eve had other children, but while Cain was the son of Eve and the serpent, the others were of direct Adamite lineage. So there is the original separation between the two lines of people, the Adamites and the interbred lineage of Eve and the Elohim. And this, of course, we find in many, many different cultures, belief systems, cosmologies, the interbreeding between the gods and the humans. And you know, that makes for all the mythology, right? And makes for all the uh war stories and the family feuds and everything that's been going on ever since. If we look at this from just a different standpoint, you know, all it takes is to remove the word gods and replace it with their name, the Elohim or the Anunnaki, and we get a completely different story. And then if we remove the word God, we don't think of them as the omnipotent prime creator, but of a different, maybe at that time more advanced, technologically speaking, species. Now, that if you take all of that into account, you begin to more and more realize that the one primary creator does not seem to appear in the Bible, which of course that's what we talked about in the first two uh, episodes of this series, that we might have looked at the Bible the wrong way, and it might have been sold to us. And I don't even want to say sold, because this has been done such a long time ago that those who perpetuate the story usually are not in the know anymore. They are just as blind as we are on this. But that the Bible being the foundation of our spiritual thinking and believing and acting might not be what it appears to be. It doesn't seem to be a spiritual text after all. And this will, I mean, this will send, when this becomes, or at least is considered, even among believers, that they might have, you know, seen things in the wrong light, or were deceived to see things in the wrong light, I should better say. This might send a shockwave through people. I can only assume. I was always way too skeptical to be in it. right? I was way too skeptical, never skeptical of the creator whatsoever, but skeptical of all the stories that I've been told that just not seem to have aligned with what I felt. And I could never reconcile the fact in my head that the all powerful creator that created everything would be vengeful, punishing, demand sacrifices, killings, worship, all these things. Because I thought, if that's the pinnacle, if that's the top of the mountain, if that's the end of the rope, the beginning, the end, the alpha, the omega, if that's everything, good Lord. And why do we strive for something higher than that? Why do we have an inner guidance system that wants us to become better and better and better in that, if the God of the Old Testament was a vicious son of a bitch? All right, let's move forward here. The adversities of the Adamite group began well before the encounter with the snake and the non-existent apple. Okay, in Genesis chapter 2, Belenia reminds us, it is said that the Elohim gave all the animals to Adam so that he could name them. We know this story. Adam named all the animals. It is in this chapter that the Elohim realized that the company of animals is not enough for Adam. And here's going to be a quick trigger warning. This next thing might upset some of you, but I'm just stating what we found here. It is then more and more unlikely that the Lord of God was some sort of omnipotent God who first needed to observe Adam at work before understanding that he needed a woman. So this is sort of a conclusion that Bellino comes to, where he says, "Hold on. So you're telling me we're talking about an all-powerful God, the one creator that created the cosmos, everything that's in it to perfection. But he needed to first observe his creation. He needed to first look at how Adam behaved in a Garden of Eden, and he needed to first see what his needs might be, or whatever, and then act accordingly." That doesn't seem to point to the all-powerful Almighty One. And I get that conclusion by Bellino, by the way. According to biblical account, for a time there were only males and animals in the Gan Eden. What sort of scenes were the Elohim subjected to? According to the medieval Rabbi Rashi, Adam had intercourse with all the animals, but he was not satisfied until he joined with Eve. Once they had made Eve one fine day, they presented her to Adam. And he said, according to the text, "This time it is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." This time. This time. With those words, it is clearly stated that before Eve, Adam had been offered several females that were not satisfactory to him. The expression "this time" appears in Jewish translations as "finally," precisely to indicate that only at that moment had Adam received a female suitable for him, made from his own genetic heritage. Again, none of this really points to the Almighty One. It points to a different story. The Sumerian Akkadian accounts from which the biblical story derives tells us how the so-called divinities had made various attempts to produce the so-called Adam. The first experiments resulted in defective men. They couldn't close their eyes or their hands. Some had a twisted spine or could not hold their urine. It was only after several attempts that a female Anunnaki was able to produce a complete and fully operational Adam. And here, once we get into this language, this kind of thinking, we see that it's a completely different story. And I wonder if we could find parallels today where we're talking, and in our community, especially, if you seek truth and freedom, you've certainly heard about biolabs, about chimeric experimentations, about underground facilities, and about transhumanism, genetic engineering. And I wonder as history seems to repeat, as we seem to follow a certain kind of blueprint that, by the way, is encoded into parts of the Bible. This is how fully this circle, comes full circle. And we're finding ourselves again in this position. And I wonder if what happens is that after a reset, the findings just seem too fantastical often for people to say this is science, this is engineering, it's maybe it isn't hard for the rulers to convince the people after these cyclical resets that we're talking about fables, we're talking about myths, we're talking about stories and fairy tales, allegories, symbolic language. But we're not talking about symbolic language when we talk about transhumanism today. When we talk about a cyborg, we're not talking about symbolic beings. We're talking about real mergers between technology and biology that are happening in front of our eyes that we can see, we can touch, we can see. These are not stories. When we talk about CRISPR, when we talk about these genetic technologies, when we talk about all the stuff that's going on, brain implants, Neuralink, what you name it, these are not allegories. These are not symbolic stories. This is facts. And if we can accept that we go through cycles and that this is by no means the first technological age, nor is it the most advanced one compared to previous ones, then why would we have such a hard time believing that what is laid out in these texts describes the rise and fall of these ages, that it describes something that happened maybe not just once but many times? It would seem logical that we've been genetically tampered with multiple times. The last one that contemporary science at least points to, as Greg Braden says to us oftentimes, is 220,000 years ago, when a few distinct changes were made that I think gave us what the American Indians, the Native Americans, called the gift of the feather, of awareness, of consciousness. But all of this is always it's always packaged in a cloud of mysticism and they descended from heaven and they gave us the gift and this is how we hear it. But what if it was genetic tampering? What if it was genetic engineering? And what if these entities are still doing the same thing? What if it never stopped? I'm just putting things out there because the conclusions that a non-conspiracy theorist, which Mauro Bilinio wasn't, he was simply a scholar of languages and biblical texts. But after all these years of studying, the conclusions he comes to are not maybe the exact same as mine, but that there is a powerful entity, a powerful group that's been steering the story, the human story, and the story of this realm since eons, and that every now and then we reach a level of awareness that allows us to see that and to rebel, maybe, as we've done before. The question is, will this knowledge that we're gathering now, will this new information, or looking at this information in a new light, will it allow us to actually succeed in this? And I think this is why so many people, so many spirits came here at this time for this mission. I think it is a mission. I think we want to free ourselves from this burden. We want to free the spirit from this burden of this experience. And we want to return not to the Gan Eden, which is, I believe, a false paradise, but we want to return to prime Earth. I don't know how exactly what the path there is. I simply know that with every piece of knowledge that I gain and that I find, and it becomes a little easier for me to see that path, or it becomes a little easier for me to believe that path is available to us. this will require assistance, psychological assistance, maybe even spiritual assistance, because this deprogramming of the religious program is so painful because people think it's all or nothing. It's if this story isn't true or it was something else, then everything was a lie. Everything wasn't a lie. I don't think that our prime creator is a lie. I really don't. And I think that different sections, different parts of the Bible give us a different level of truth and accuracy than others and integrity. I really don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but I also don't want to remain in a way of thinking just for fake peace sake. And I have already seen that we have, just by doing this, just by having these discussions, many people felt offended. Many people are turning away. Friends are turning away. We've noticed this, and I think more people will turn away, and that has to be okay. I can't, by no, for no, under no circumstances will I ever sacrifice my findings, my research, my perspectives in order to not lose popularity or subscribers or any of that. That can never be part of the process. That's the whole problem with everything mainstream, is that is more important than the seeking for truth and the finding of truth. That becomes more important in this system, like we've been discussing over and over again. How many, if you live in a monastery, if you decide to dedicate your life to theology, to religion, to union with God, and you live in a monastery for 50, 60, 70 years, and all you do is study religious texts, all you do is study prayer, all you do is go deeper and deeper because that's why you're there. You cannot tell me that after 50, 60, 70 years as a nun, as a monk, that you do not find the discrepancies, that you do not find the doubts, that you do not see that. But because the church, the institution, the tradition, the convention is more important than the truth, they often remain silent. Not all of them. Some were great warriors for truth, and they paid the price. They were excluded, they were killed, they were persecuted. But some are always willing to look at the truth and look at a different perspective. And I will say this again as a simple, logical thought. If you can conceive of the fact that every aspect of our history and of our societal fabric has been tampered with or simply invented, simply fabricated, then you cannot possibly believe that the only thing that was not tampered with is religion and the religious texts. How in the world would logic let you lead you to that belief? I don't understand it. And the biggest opposition, of course, comes from this uh, need to defend what people believed in for so long. I understand it from a psychological standpoint. I understand it from a peace kind of standpoint, but people believed in certain medical interventions until 2020, 2021. They believed in that. They believed wholeheartedly. They allowed that to happen to their kids. They believed that was the saving treatment for humanity. And for over 100 years, it's been a practice that a lot of people never questioned. And then 2021 came around, and 2022 came around, 2023 came around, and we're experiencing a phenomenon that we haven't seen in our lifetime, and many people have never seen it, of course, which shows people the evidence that what they previously believed is simply not true, and that the exact opposite is true. It's not just that it isn't true, the opposite is true. Now, you all know what I'm talking about. I have to talk a little in code here, but you know what I'm talking about. All I'm asking for all For all believers, just give yourself permission to consider a different perspective. That's all. I don't want to convert you. I don't want to denounce you. I don't want to criticize you. That's not my intention at all. And if because religion has had so much positive effect on people too, or aspects of it, I should say. As I said before, there are many places in the world that are better because there are religious practices, because there is prayer, because there is goodwill, because there is a connection to something higher. So it's had a lot of positive effect, or at least that which we believe religion to be. And we can take those positive spiritual practices and pull them out from the rest, pull them out from the deception and the lies and the misinterpretations. We can do that. This book most certainly is not, or these 60 something books or 80 something books, because nobody really knows how many there are, or just very few people. They're certainly not untouchable. As we've seen, they translated this from that and that to that, from Latin to Greek, Greek to Latin, Hebrew to Greek, Greek to Latin, and then into English. And then you read the original English translations and you read today's King James version. You go, that's not even, none of the chapters say the same thing. Okay, I'm gonna take a breath here. Three parts. The first two parts of this series, The End of Religion as We Know It, are in the video description. The link to this book here is in the video description. The Naked Bible. I think it's a great book, great read. Again, I don't say this is the truth. If you read this, you'll know everything. It's a great stepping stone, and we'll continue this series. I don't know exactly when, but there's definitely more to come, much more to come. I look forward to it. But for those who haven't seen the first two parts, they're down there. And I would just, encourage you to check it out. All right, my friends, much love, many blessings. Have a wonderful rest of your day. We love you. We appreciate you. We'll be back with you again very, very soon.